teach economics here at Marlborough College, as almost all of you know. And economists are often accused of pulling the on the one hand, on the other hand thing, but I think I'll begin that way. So on the one hand, as we all know, I think in this audience in particular, we face at the moment unprecedented environmental challenges as regards global climate change, loss of biodiversity, and in a host of other arenas. On the other hand, I would say, after a rather bleak period, there's some basis for optimism, although maybe slightly less than I thought so not too long ago, that in a new administration there will be fostered a more scientifically based and a more inspired environmental policy and leadership. And that dichotomy between the challenges and the opportunities is the subject of tonight's lecture. And I would say that there are a few people who are more qualified than our speaker this evening to address this set of challenges and opportunities that we face. Pat Parenteau has made a career of environmental law, working in the governmental, educational, nonprofit, and private sectors, as a scholar, as an advocate, litigator, administrator, and he's a recognized expert in environmental law and the Endangered Species Act, on water law, on climate change, among other areas. He's currently the professor of law and is senior counsel in the Environmental and Natural Resources Law Clinic at Vermont Law School. From 1976 to 1984, he held a number of positions with the National Wildlife Federation in Washington, including Vice President for Conservation. From there, and for 3 years, he served as the Regional Counsel for the United States Environmental Protection Agency, Region 1 in Boston. He served as Commissioner of the Vermont Department of Environmental Conservation from 1987 to 1989, then went out west for a spell as a partner in a law firm, during which time he served as special counsel to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, in particular during the spotted owl exemption proceedings under the Endangered Species Act. He returned to Vermont in 1993 to assume the directorship of the Vermont Law Center. In 2003, he helped found and directed the Environmental and Natural Resources Law Clinic at Vermont Law School, where he now serves, as I mentioned, as senior counsel. So it's my pleasure to welcome Pat Parenteau.
Thanks, Jim. So I'll just do like a game show host and stroll around. I might even ask you to pose a question or answer a question. That's what we like to do in law school. We haven't any answers in law school. We only have questions, always questions. One of the points that Jim made I wanted to pick right up on, and that is expectations were very high when Barack Obama became sworn in as President of the United States. And I think what we're seeing is even a person as talented, articulate, politically savvy, and committed as Barack Obama is, you may not agree with all of his policies, but I think you'd agree at least with most of them. Maybe Fox News wouldn't, but most people would agree with that characterization. I think the point to make there is that even with that, unless you have the political support of the nation behind you, and unless you can muster the kind of political support you need to get bills through Congress, whether they be dealing with healthcare or climate change or anything, energy or anything else, I don't care how good you are and how brilliant you might be as the leader of the nation, you just can't get it done. So I hope that the message to go forth is if we want to see change and improvement, if we want to address the serious challenges that we have facing our nation, we can't let it all rest on the shoulders of one person or even one administration. So the theme, title of my talk is, Can the Endangered Species Act Save the Polar Bear? And I suppose you could say, can the Endangered Species Act save us? One of the things about endangered species that often is used as a description of the role that endangered species conservation plays in national policy is the canary in the coal mine. Endangered species are sentinels. They're sending messages to human civilizations. And the message is, what's happening to me is happening to you. Every species that's on the list of threatened and endangered species tells a story. And the story that every species has to tell, whether it's the spotted owl, or the Pacific salmon, or the California condor, or the Ridley's turtle, every single species that's in danger is part of a natural community that's under stress. And every natural community that's under stress is a human community that's under stress. And the reasons why species are on these lists is because they're losing their habitat, their home. They're losing the life webs that support them. And those are the same life webs that support human civilization, that support human economies, that support agriculture, that support water quality, that support air quality, that support everything on life, on Earth, all life on Earth. So you can think of an endangered species really as a mirror. And the mirror is us. If you look at an endangered species and you ask, why is this species in trouble? What you'll find is that there is some kind of unsustainable activity going on that's causing the species to decline. In the old-growth forests of the Northwest with the spotted owl, what the spotted owl was saying is you're running out of a precious resource that not only provides timber, board feed to logging mills, but is the structure that holds together the whole aquatic system, the salmon. Thousands of species inhabit a mature, old-growth forest ecosystem. And as you begin to tear that ecosystem down and dismantle it piece by piece and fragment it deteriorates, it unravels. And as that happens, other forms of human activities that depend on healthy forests for air, for water, for fish, for jobs, for recreation, for aesthetic appreciation, as a draw for the very brightest people in the country to come and locate in that region. Think Bill Gates. Bill Gates could have gone to Houston. He didn't. He went to Seattle. Why? Because of the quality of life. What was the quality of life? The old-growth forest, the salmon, the wildlife, the ecosystem, the biological diversity. So the first message to leave you with is pay close attention to what's happening to creatures that don't perhaps command our immediate affection. They're not always charismatic megafauna. They can be as humble as a species of insect that happens to be a key pollinator in a system that requires pollination for regeneration. But these species all have stories to tell. The Endangered Species Act. Let's talk a little bit about the law. Then let's use the polar bear as kind of the symbol of this large phenomenon, crisis that's confronting us. It goes by the name of global climate change. Better name is probably climate disruption. It isn't simply change. Change can be good or bad. What's happening is more aptly described as climate disruption. But let's start with the law itself. What is this law? How does it work? Is it succeeding? And what are the prospects for law, and specifically a law like the Endangered Species Act, to address these overarching problems that we confront? Our United States Supreme Court has characterized the Endangered Species Act as the most comprehensive wildlife protection law in the world, and I think that's accurate. The law mandates that the federal government, in all of its departments, this includes departments that fund projects, carry out projects, permit projects, massive amount of development, industrial activity, manufacturing activity, energy development, forestry, agriculture. There is almost no aspect of American economic life that the federal government doesn't touch in one form or another. So the main thing that this statute does is say to this federal government that's the driver for much of what's happening in the habitats of the United States, you must conduct your business so as to assign first priority to preventing the extinction of species found on lands where this development is occurring. That's a very dramatic, almost unheard of law assigning priority to non-human life. The Endangered Species Act, at its core, is a moral statement. It's more about the species with whom we share this planet than it is about us. And that's a pretty dramatic statement. It's a statement of law, so it's a norm, it's a standard. And for that reason, it's a standard that isn't always lived up to. It's a standard that we strive for and sometimes fail. But it's fair to say that this standard, which commands the federal government to do these things, has made a significant difference. There's a lot of controversy about, is the Endangered Species Act working? Is it broken? Is it failing? Should it be repealed, amended, replaced? But the data that is collected by the scientific community on the status of species would strongly suggest that for a number of species, the Endangered Species Act has clearly saved them from extinction. The whooping crane, the bald eagle in the 48 lower states of the continental United States. Bald eagle was plentiful in Canada and Alaska, but it was all but extirpated in the lower 48 by DDT. The same thing for the peregrine falcon and the brown pelican. The Endangered Species Act was instrumental in eliminating DDT from the food webs of these species, and they rebounded very quickly. When you have a species that has been threatened by a single factor, like a chemical contaminant, if you find the source of that problem and remove it, the species can recover relatively quickly, at least measured in decades. Where you have species, however, that are on the endangered species list because they've lost vast amounts of their natural habitat, that process of recovery takes centuries, perhaps, not decades. And 80% of the species that are on the endangered species list are there because of loss of habitat. So when you look at a statute or a law or a norm like that, and you ask, is it succeeding? You can't measure success by how many of these species have fully recovered to the point where they no longer require this special protection that the law requires. You have to have more subtle measurements. Are they at least not declining? Are they stabilized? Are they improving? And when you look at questions like that, you find that most of the species that are on the list are in fact improving. There's over 1,500 species listed under this statute. There are another 3,000 that are probably eligible for listing. There's an international organization that puts out annual census on the status of species called the Red Book, the IUCN Red Book. And the bad news, the sad news is that every year that list of imperiled species is growing, and the rate at which it's growing is increasing. But according to the latest statistics on the listed species, a number of species clearly would have gone extinct but for the Endangered Species Act, and a number of other species are improving. And the more that we invest, of course, in efforts to restore these species, the more we develop recovery plans with specific measurable objectives, the more that we reform practices like clear-cutting of old-growth forests and replacing them with single monoculture pine plantations, the faster that species can recover. So the law works as fast and as well as we're willing to use it, and as well as the economic interests that drive development and land conversion are willing to change the way in which we go about development to provide more opportunities for habitat preservation and restoration. So the Endangered Species Act has a lot of success stories. We thought the whooping crane at one time was down to 23 individuals. The largest wild flock of whooping cranes in the United States now is up around 180, and they've introduced a second flock that hopefully will be established in the eastern United States. The black-footed ferret was thought to be extinct until a rancher's dog brought one home one night, and its mouth, dead, of course. And the biologists went out looking, and they found a few more ferrets, and they started a recovery program that had some unfortunate accidents in the early stages, but eventually they began rebuilding the black-footed ferret population, which is an indicator species for the Great Plains prairie ecosystems of the United States. The gray whale was recovered and off the list. The American alligator, the same thing. There you can find a number of success stories, and you take some hope from those success stories. But the number of stories of species sliding closer and closer to extinction and becoming eligible for listing is unfortunately growing much, much faster than the success stories. The other part of the Endangered Species Act that speaks beyond the federal government is a requirement that everyone, whether it's governmental, non-governmental, private, corporate, every entity that's engaged in activities that affect endangered species is under the command not to take the species. And the take is defined to mean kill or wound or trap, sort of the common understanding of the word take. But also the concept of harm and harass. Again, the Endangered Species Act, this is the 1973 Act that I'm talking about, was quite far-seeing in saying, you know, it's not enough not to kill species and hunt them or harvest them. We have to protect their habitat if we're going to have species into the future. And so they introduced the notion that when habitat destruction reaches a certain point, it's even worse than killing individuals because you may be destroying the reproductive capacity of an entire species when you destroy its nesting habitat, when you destroy its food source. And so the other part of the Endangered Species Act that has had a fairly dramatic effect on species survival prohibits people from undertaking actions that would cause so much habitat loss that it would literally result in actual death or injury through the impairment of the breeding process, for example. And as a result of that command, which some would find onerous for sure, a program has grown up of developing habitat conservation plans so that when forestry operations are going to be cutting a certain amount of habitat, they're also going to be leaving another part of the forest alone and regrowing habitat in still other areas to replace the habitat that's being harvested, so that at the end of the process you either end up with an equal amount of habitat, or if you're lucky, even more habitat than you began with. And this introduces the concept of thinking on a landscape scale, not thinking on the individual parcel in question of habitat, but rather thinking about a species' entire life cycle and the range that it occupies and the other species upon which it depends, because, of course, ecosystems are interdependent. That's the essence of an ecosystem. There are relationships within ecosystems, predator-prey, symbiosis, pollination, engineering. There are certain species that actually literally physically engineer ecosystems, that move nutrients through ecosystems, that move energy from one level of an ecosystem to another. The more that you know about how ecosystems work and function and the life history of the species that compose the ecosystem, and which species in the ecosystem are keystone species to the functioning of the ecosystem, the more that you know about that, the better able you are to manage the way that we use the land and the resources, water, trees, vegetation, and so forth that go with it. It's not always the case that it's an either-or proposition, either the animal, the species, or the economic activity. More often than not, there is a way to produce economic activity, to create jobs, to grow wealth, to improve people's quality of life, that's more consistent with preserving the natural system than it is tearing the natural system apart. A lot of the problems we have, whether it's endangered species, pollution control, or any number of other environmental problems is actually the result of ignorance, sometimes, frankly, outright stupidity. And it's not necessarily an irreconcilable conflict between the goals of species conservation and economic development. If it were that case, then there would be almost no hope, perhaps, for many species, but it's really not that case. It may be that in the short run, there will be economic dislocation as a result of responding to the needs and the threats to species. I'm not going to say it's always easy to make these transitions. That's not the point, but it's certainly possible and doable if the right amount of goodwill and good information is brought to bear on the problem. So we've had the Endangered Species Act now for over 30 years, and it's probably time for changes to the Act. The Act does not contain enough incentives. Most of the processes of the statute have been the nature of regulation and prohibition, and there hasn't been enough focus on creating incentives and literally rewarding people for doing, quote, the right thing for species conservation. But of course, incentives is another word for incentives is money. And if you want to improve the way species habitats are used and managed, oftentimes that means either leaving them alone entirely or certainly allowing areas that have been disturbed and degraded to be restored and renewed. And that ultimately means someone has to pay. You can either tell people through a regulation that certain kinds of activities that harm species are not going to be allowed. That's one approach. Or you can tell people, I'm going to pay you not to do the activities that harm and threaten the species. Those are basically your choices. There are some people who will do things for the benefit of species and natural habitats out of a purely altruistic motivation. These would be people in an economic position who are able to do that, and there aren't very many of them. But if you were to leave to altruism the fate of species, I'm confident there would be far fewer success stories than we have today. So the choices really come down to you either regulate activity to prevent the damage or you pay people to avoid the damage, one or the other. And each one of those options has challenges and problems with it. On the incentive side, how much is it going to cost? Are you going to put conservation easements all across the United States so that habitats are preserved? And you can't just preserve pockets of habitat. Habitat has to be interconnected. There have to be corridors for species that migrate. You have to think on a landscape scale, and it can get quite expensive if you're talking about buying compliance with habitat conservation. So these are some challenges that we face with the existing statute. Let me shift now to the polar bear and this climate disruption phenomenon. We're already in an era of mass extinction. Many conservation biologists have written books. I have a whole shelf full, maybe 2 shelves at this point, full of books on the extinction crisis. The problem is the rate of extinction, because of course extinction is part of evolution. But what we've got going on at this point is an extinction rate that's hundreds or thousands of times what the natural rate or background rate of extinction would be in the absence of human activity. And there's legions of studies and books and reports on this whole notion of how you calculate extinction rates. And I won't spend a lot of time on that here unless people have some questions about it later. But suffice to say that we are experiencing what the biologists term the 6th great extinction. There have been 5 mass extinctions in the geologic history of the world, the last 65 million years ago with the dinosaurs extinction. And What we have now is extinction in slow motion. We don't have one big event like a meteor shower striking the Earth, which is the suspected cause of the dinosaur extinction. What we have instead is a massive amount of human population using resources, consuming resources on Earth at an ever-increasing geometric rate. The human species uses about 45% of the net primary production on Earth. One species is commanding almost half of the biomass, if you want to think about it that way, on Earth. And of course, our population at 6-point-some billion is headed for 9 or 10 billion at current rates. So this mass extinction event that we're already witnessing, where conservation biologists, evolutionary biologists like E.O. Wilson and others are saying we're losing about 27,000 species a year from the planet. Most of those would be insect species in the tropical forests. And most of those figures and calculations are based on model projections. We don't actually see species going extinct. We don't even know how many species there are on the planet, even to an order of magnitude. We've cataloged about 1.7 million, but the estimates go 5, 10, 15 million. There's no real way of knowing. I don't think there's any way we'll ever know how many species there are on Earth. It's even a question of what you mean by species. What differentiates one species from another is a subject of great scientific debate. But the point is, by whatever measure you want to use, the rate at which we're losing habitat and losing species is accelerating, and the rate at which humans are driving this process of extinction and literally substituting a sort of anthropogenic evolutionary pattern on Earth is cause for great consternation among the scientific community. So that's the situation as we sit here today. Now you add the threat of climate disruption to that, and the consequences for humanity are horrific to contemplate with the studies that are increasingly coming out of the scientific establishment worldwide. But just focusing on the biodiversity of the Earth, the calculations of what different levels of climate change, global warming, temperature increase are going to cause in terms of species extinction are astounding. Even under the most optimistic scenarios, these would be the models that have been developed by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is the definitive scientific body on Earth studying and reporting on climate change. Even under the most optimistic scenarios for this century, you're looking at a loss of a third of species on Earth. And it can go as high as 2/3, depending on how many levels of temperature increase on the Celsius scale we go. In the 2007 report, the fourth assessment of the IPCC, which is comprised of over 1,000 climatologists, the thought was that the projection of greenhouse gas emissions and the sensitivity of the climate's response to the loading of the atmosphere with those greenhouse gas emissions would result in a temperature increase, average global temperature increase this century, of from 1 to 6 degrees Celsius. Well, we're already at 0.8 degrees Celsius with the temperature increase that has occurred within the last 100 years and really within the last 50 years when you look at the data. We're already bearing down on 1 degree Celsius, and the problem with atmospheric loading is that there's always this delay effect. In other words, the temperatures that we have today have not fully reflected the amount of greenhouse gases that are already in the atmosphere. When you take that into account, and when you go beyond just looking at carbon dioxide and you look at more potent gases like methane and nitrous oxide, when you factor all those factors into the equation, we're actually probably closer to 1.5 degrees Celsius in terms of the way the temperature is going to respond to those concentrations in the atmosphere. So the latest projections and risk assessments from MIT and the Hadley Institute and all of the sort of unquestioned experts in the field are constantly ratcheting up these projected global temperature increases, and with that, the consequent melting of the polar ice caps, the sea level rise, and the whole parade of horribles that go with all those projections. So even under the best of circumstances, we're looking at a changed planet this century. I have the unfortunate obligation and duty to tell the truth about what's happening, even as I see it and as I understand it. And sometimes people shrink from that. They really don't want to tell the truth about what we're facing, but I think we have to be honest and be truthful about what it is we're facing. So that then raises the question, is there any hope? And there's always hope. There may not be optimism, but there's always hope. And so what I'd like to sort of focus on is the hope part of it. The polar bear is a good kind of symbolic icon for what's happening with climate change. The projection, the polar bear, of course, hunts from ice. That's the platform on which this species survives. It's a maritime species. And the projections from the experts, the United States Geological and Biological Survey, are in this century we're going to lose 2/3 at least of the population of polar bears on Earth. That's why they were listed as threatened. Probably should have been listed as endangered. And the only hope that the biologists see for the polar bear are these really remote ice packs in the far Arctic Circle areas of the globe where there will be remnant populations. The rate at which the Arctic is melting is 2 or 3 times faster than any place else on Earth, and the temperature rises in the Arctic are correspondingly the same. And of course, what the scientists have discovered is that their models were linear models. They were based on loadings of the atmosphere and the sensitivity of the climate and responding to those loadings. And what they didn't take into account, and still haven't figured out how in the models to take into account, are all these feedback loops. So one major feedback loop in the Arctic with the polar bear is the loss of the white sea ice and the replacement of the white ice with dark ocean. And the dark ocean tends to concentrate the heat, which drives the melting process. And that's one of the feedback loops that is driving Arctic melting. That for a while, the scientists thought the Arctic wouldn't be ice-free in the summer until very late in the century. Now they're saying the Arctic will undoubtedly, most likely be ice-free by 2013. So for the polar bear, it doesn't look good. And there's not much that can be done about that other than to understand that the rate at which climate change, global warming, is occurring has probably already foreclosed most of the options for saving that species. So it's frankly unlikely that the Endangered Species Act, no matter what was done under the Endangered Species Act, could save that species. Rather, you have to look at the polar bear now as an example, as a sentinel for what's going to be happening more broadly as a result of climate change. So, in a sense, the hope is simply this, that if people are willing to spend the time, and this is a big if, to understand the nature of the threat that's presented, the hope is that a political consensus will emerge, not to tinker at the problem, not to try to make incremental progress, That's the way we've done things in the past with environmental problems. Let's clean up the air and the water, but let's do it gradually, a little bit at a time, so it doesn't have a big economic impact, so that it doesn't send a real shock to the social systems, the economic systems of our country and of the globe. That's not going to work with climate change. This is not a situation where you can make it up later. This is a situation where you either take the action now that needs to be taken, or there won't be a later opportunity. So if the polar bear can be an example to people of what happens when we fail to stand up to and face up to the challenges that we have, then perhaps its demise, if that's its fate, will be of some help, some benefit to the rest of species. But the debate that's happening in Congress right now over how much reduction of greenhouse gases we're going to achieve by 2020 and 2050, these are good debates. They're long overdue, obviously. Some of the windows of opportunity we may have had to prevent some of these tipping points, as the scientists refer to them. If we'd had these debates 10 years ago, 20 years ago, perhaps we wouldn't be in the situation we're in, but we are. So the debates that are occurring are good, and the arguments over what the targets should be and how quickly we can begin to reduce greenhouse gas emissions on a meaningful scale, and that would frankly be on the order of 2 or 3% per year, as opposed to the increase, which until the recent economic downturn had been 2 or 3% per year increase. We have to turn that around and go the other way. The point is, the earlier you can get the reductions, the quicker you can stabilize the climate and avoid some of these tipping points. One of the most troubling of the recent studies on climate change is what's happening to the chemistry of the oceans. The oceans are the largest sink of carbon dioxide on the planet, and the problem with the oceans is they're overextended in terms of their ability to assimilate carbon. Basically, what happens when carbon goes into the ocean is it finds living organisms, biological organisms, and cycles through them. The ocean can no longer cycle the carbon. So now the effect of the ocean is to change the pH. The ocean is a base chemistry system, and slight, very, very slight changes in its pH values causes enormous problems for calcification. And what you have going on is a carbonic acid effect of all the CO2 that's going into the ocean from power plants and automobiles and other things. That's a problem that is extremely worrisome, because there's really no way to undo that. It could be that we could learn to adapt to a warming world, even a world that is where average global temperatures are at 2 or 3 degrees Celsius. That's going to cause massive dislocations of people in low-lying areas. It's going to mean famine and flood and droughts and storms. It's going to mean a lot of really horrible things and a lot of loss of species. But the human civilization, in one shape or another, could probably figure out how to adapt to a 2 to 3 degrees Celsius increase. At least that's what the leading scientists, many of them are saying. Some are saying, I'm not sure even that's true. But if you look at the rate at which the oceans are turning acid, and you start to contemplate what does it mean to lose the entire marine ecosystem, how do you even begin to comprehend something like that? And the only answer to that is to stop the loading of the oceans with CO2. There are some scientists studying what are called geoengineering strategies. These are Rube Goldberg ideas, frankly. Things like putting millions of mirrors in space to reflect the radiation, creating volcanoes like Mount Pinatubo to spray sulfur dioxide aerosols into the Earth's atmosphere to create a blanket effect over the Earth to cool it. So, some of the remedies that scientists are now talking about, you would think they were crazy, but these are legitimate, bona fide, credentialed scientists. What they're basically saying is we have no faith that humanity will in fact act in the way it needs to act to control and stabilize the climate. So we have to look at ideas that would strike some as crazy. So the hope is simply that the leadership of people like Barack Obama, Barbara Boxer, John Kerry, Henry Waxman, and the few courageous, or perhaps at least well-positioned political leaders, that their effort to move legislation on a large, dramatic scale, I'm talking about transformation legislation, not pecking away at the problem legislation. We need to transform the global economy, transform it to a carbon-neutral economy. That's what we're talking about. And so that's why I say there's no reason to be optimistic about that right now. There's every reason to hope that we will, in fact, get serious about it, and that the United States will do what it should have been doing for a long, long time, which is to show some real leadership on that. But our politics in the United States are driven by geopolitics. You've got to make a deal with the coal state senators. You've got to make a deal with the farm state senators. You've got to make a deal with the automotive state senators. And, you know, that's our democracy here in the United States. That's the way it works. It's the way it's always worked. That's not going to change overnight. But that system of constantly whittling down the legislation to the point where it's really not a game-changing piece of legislation simply isn't going to work. And, you know, we here in this audience will experience, trust me, we are already, and we will experience more of the effects of what's going on in the climate systems of Earth, but nothing like what's going to happen 10, 20, 30, 40 years down the road. So it's a very, very daunting problem to get Americans to think that long term and to take actions now that will have benefits they'll never see. It's one of the most daunting challenges I think I've ever seen in the entire realm of environmental law. But we've just got to do as much as we possibly can do and convince as many people as possible that it's worth doing. And so it's a challenge we'll all have to face and deal with together. Thanks. So, questions, comments? Yes, sir.
Hi, Don.
You want to use this?
I'm sorry you have to tell the truth.
Yeah.
It's very disquieting. It's a sad situation. I wonder if you would comment on a slightly different dimension of the question. You dwelt very heavily on the Endangered Species Act, which is a remarkably good act, and then used the polar bears as your icon. But then you even, in passing, mentioned you wonder whether the Endangered Species Act will suffice to protect the polar bear. The point I want to make is that the polar bear depends not just on the United States, but on Canada, Russia, Denmark, and Norway. And as a matter of fact, in 1973, a very progressive polar bear protection treaty was enacted with all of those countries participating. And so my question is, first of all, the problems in general, and maybe specifically with the polar bear, it isn't just the United States. So how do we cooperate with these other countries or coerce them into participating on the one hand? And secondly, how do we convert what we agreed to, let's say in the Polar Bear Treaty of 1973, which is not covered in the Endangered Species Act. How do we get that into U.S. domestic law?
Yeah. That's a good point. Climate change is clearly a global issue and requires all the nations of the world to cooperate in addressing it. The treaty that you point out with the polar bear is an interesting example of how, if it weren't for climate disruption, the polar bear would be fine. There are tens of thousands of polar bears. The population of polar bears is not the problem. That treaty in managing polar bear habitat, it would have worked brilliantly without climate disruption. But the point is that treaties don't matter if the ice isn't there. And for global, the next meeting of the nations of the world is December in Copenhagen to try to negotiate a new climate pact treaty to take over when the Kyoto Protocol expires in 2012. And the United States has pledged to go and negotiate the treaty. But of course, the Obama administration can't negotiate anything that won't be ratified by 2/3 of the United States Senate. That's why you're seeing all this pressure to move this bill that was introduced by John Kerry and Barbara Boxer this week. Try to get that to the floor of the Senate and get it passed. Get as far as you can, in other words, with domestic legislation to strengthen the hand of Todd Stern, who's the special envoy for climate when he goes to Copenhagen. And this notion that who goes first that we've been playing for so long is silly, frankly. We'd say, well, we're not going to sign a treaty unless China signs a treaty. And China says, we're not signing a treaty unless you go first. I mean, you'd think this was a sandbox instead of adults' conversation going on here. But the United States has got to come to Copenhagen with something tangible. They cannot expect the developing countries of the world, India, China, Brazil, South Africa, let alone the even poorer countries of the world, to do anything, frankly. Our per capita emission of CO2 is 13 times what an average Indian is. It's almost 8 times what a Chinese citizen is. China is doing more to reduce at least the intensity of its CO2 emissions than we are. China is the world's leader in producing wind and solar, primarily because they have cheap labor, but nevertheless, that's what's happening. So, there's all kinds of things that the United States can do, must do, to show leadership so that the rest of the nations of the world will follow. We used to do that. The treaty that created the Endangered Species Act in 1972 to 73, was negotiated in Washington, D.C., and Richard Nixon was the one who called the International Convention to deal with endangered species, and he was the one who signed the Endangered Species Act. So we, at one time, were leaders on these issues, and we're not, obviously, now, and we're trying to restore that. But as I say, the administration can't deliver this. It's going to have to be pressure put on the Congress of the United States by constituents demanding that we do it. Will that happen? I don't know. When the polls are taken, climate change usually ranks somewhere down at the bottom of people's concerns. Yeah, they've heard about it. They know there's some controversy about it, and it may not be a good thing, but, I don't have a job. I lost my house. I can't pay the bill. My kids aren't going to college. I mean, it's understandable why an issue like climate change doesn't rank, and maybe it never will. That's why I'm telling the truth. I don't know that this is a problem that can, frankly, be conquered. I hope it is, but that's my answer to having the whole world has to get behind meaningful reductions, and by meaningful, I'm talking about 80 to 90% reductions in carbon by 2050. That's what I mean by transformational policy. We've never done anything like that, anything close to that. And yet that's what the science is saying. This is a math problem. This is physics. This isn't, we'll have a little of this and a little of this. Is straightforward math. When you get to 2 degrees Celsius, these are the circumstances that happen. When you get to 3 degrees Celsius, these are the circumstances we think are going to happen. It would be nice to see some science that starts cutting the other way and saying, oh my goodness, I think we overstated this problem. I think we missed a variable that actually is going to mitigate some of these problems. Or, you know, I would love at least one theory of the deniers, at least one theory to be proven to be established scientifically. Just one. Just some good news that all the bad news is really wrong. That's what I'm hoping for. But so far, none of the theories of explaining what's happening have been able to pass scientific muster. Yes, sir?
Let me just look around for a second. There are a lot of young people here tonight, some geezers too, there's one back there. We geezers are not going to be affected by it, but they are. And so they're sitting there thinking, this sounds really bad. What? No, I don't. What can I do? In my case, I have two senators who are doing the right thing. I don't live in another state where I have to write them and say, wake up. So what do we do as individuals?
Yeah.
Rank them. Give us 5. Give us 2. Tell us where to start.
Well, you can go down the list of every senator that comes from a state that produces coal and know where the problem is. Coal produces over 50% of our electricity. And we have the most coal of any nation on earth. You get the picture? So all of the problems that the Democrats are having, after all, the Democrats are in control. You would think that the Democrats could get a bill passed, wouldn't you? Well, no, they can't. And if you just go down the list, Illinois, West Virginia, Virginia, Ohio, and find out where the coal is, and that's where the problem is. That's where the problem is. Because those senators and those representatives from those states are not going to go along with a bill that's going to put a price on coal. And the only way you're going to reduce carbon dioxide is to put a price on coal. And that price is going to have to keep going up and up and up and up. And it's going to hurt. It's going to hurt bad. There's no question about it. Don't deny it. Don't try to hide from it. You're going to have to figure out ways of buffering the impact of the price shock that has to happen. You know, there's no free lunch, no easy way to do this, no soft path, no somebody's going to figure this out, I don't have to do anything different. That's not going to happen. So you're going to have to get the price of coal up to the point where, frankly, coal no longer is a viable fuel. And you start building smart grids and smart meters and plug-in hybrids and solar concentrating plants in the desert and wind generation facilities off the shore. Now that Teddy Kennedy's gone, I guess they'll get one at Nantucket. And each one of these things that I'm talking about are going to be painful, difficult choices. I don't like the ideas of turbines all the way down the Great Plains chewing up my whooping cranes. I don't like the idea of solar concentrating plants on top of desert tortoises in the Mojave Desert. But you know what? We're going to have to deal with those kinds of choices. So what the first answer is, politics. We can all do things in our individual life. We can buy our CFLs, we can buy fuels, Energy Star appliances, we can carpool, we can stop flying all over the place. We can do 150 things in our individual lives to make a little difference and to feel a little bit better about what we're doing individually and walking the talk and putting skin in the game and all the rest of it. And we're doing that in our family. And you know, I don't accept hardly any flying invitations anymore. I used to fly around the country all the time, go to all these conferences, make speeches like this one, have a gala. I don't do that anymore. It's wrong. It's wrong. We can't do that. And we don't need to do that. We can webinar, we can use technology. We don't have to get on an airplane and fly to a conference. It's ridiculous. So we can do lots of things in our private, professional lives to address this problem, walk the talk. But ultimately, it means changing votes. It means you either convince your congressman and your senator from a coal state, or I could talk about offsets. One of the biggest scams in this whole legislative game that's going on is instead of buying real reductions and requiring real reductions in CO2, people are being allowed to buy offsets. Well, what's an offset? Well, an offset is corn ethanol. Well, where are corn ethanol plants? Well, they're in all the farm belt parts of the country where the agricultural economies have collapsed, and corn ethanol is bailing them out. And what is corn ethanol's carbon footprint? Well, if you do a life cycle analysis of corn ethanol, and you see all the land conversion that has to be required to grow all the corn to make all the ethanol, and you put all the energy inputs into your equation, all of a sudden you find out that corn ethanol actually is increasing carbon dioxide emissions, not decreasing it. So all this phony baloney stuff about offsets is just another way of saying, okay, Farm Belt, in order to get your support for the bill, I'm going to give you this subsidy program of corn ethanol, which is not good for the planet. It's not good for the land. It's not good for air quality or water quality, because all that corn is a very destructive plant. It takes all the nutrients out of soil. It's very hard on soil. And studies have shown that, you know, the nutrient loadings in the Gulf of Mexico coming down the Mississippi River are almost all agricultural runoff. And it's almost all from this massive production of corn and other annual crops. So a climate change bill that promotes that kind of practice is absolutely the wrong thing to do. But the political reality is you don't get the votes to pass the bill without those kinds of deals in it. I don't know how we break out of that. And you're right that the senators, you know, from our part of the world aren't the quote-unquote problem. But, you know, those of you from other parts of the country, find out how your senators are voting and your representatives are voting. Write them and ask them, what's your position on reductions, on auctioning allowances, on offsets? Pin them down. Make them account for their positions. That's the only hope I can see. Yes, sir.
You're talking a lot about the difficulties of getting politicians to agree to major transformational legislation, both in the U.S. and globally. And you're also talking about the fact that so many of the compromises that have to be made domestically are because of business interests in specific states. What is the prospect for engaging the private sector in the solution, and what is the potential of engaging the private sector in the solution as opposed to engaging the problem politically?
It's good. There's a coalition of business interests who are very supportive of what I would characterize as good to strong climate legislation. In fact, it was that coalition that basically drafted the Waxman-Markey bill. And it's a coalition of environmental groups and business groups. And there's some surprising names on that list, like Duke Power, which has a lot of coal and nuclear plants. But they, you know, Jim Rogers, the head of Duke Power, understands climate science, understands what needs to be done, and is supportive of laws to do that. General Electric, Jeffrey Immelt is another one. Then there's some usual, ones that wouldn't surprise you, like Google is a major player in that whole arena. So yeah, engaging the private sector is absolutely critical. The business community is not homogenous. Peabody Coal, you're never going to convince them. Forget about it. Exxon, no, probably not. But, the insurance industry for sure. If there's one industry on earth that understands what the models are saying about sea level rise, it's the insurance industry. That's why they won't write policies anywhere in the coastal zone. Anywhere. Now, there is no private insurance available in the coastal zone. Try to find it if you can. So there are lots of businesses and industries that are on board, but some of them are afraid to step out on their own. They want to go in a herd. They want to go with a group, and they want the government to create a level playing field for them. They don't want to be disadvantaged by trade imbalances overseas. So some of them are arguing if we agree to hard caps on our CO2 emissions, we're going to have a tariff at the border for products coming from China and India and other places that don't. So that's a huge issue. And that split the political coalition in Congress badly over the trade policy issues. And that'll benefit some parts of the country and disadvantage other parts of the country. It's a Rubik's Cube, in other words. The politics of this issue, the politics of a lot of issues, are a Rubik's Cube. And if you can figure out how to get everything to line up, then you can succeed. But I would say the private sector has come an awful long way on this issue in the last 10 years, at least. There's still many more that we need, coming on board, but there's definitely support from a lot of major corporations in America for doing this. Walmart has insisted that all of its supply chain go carbon neutral. Now, you can say what you want about Walmart. I'm no big fan of Walmart, that's for sure. But, you know, they have the economic power to make that happen. And they are making it happen. They are single-handedly reducing the carbon footprint of the products they're selling in all those Walmart stores. So, you know, those are the hopeful signs, I guess you'd say, is that there are some signs out there. Yes?
Recently, there was a gentleman who said that it would be more beneficial to let the giant panda go extinct because it was so expensive to keep them and be able to keep them on the endangered species list. Would you say that was a good idea and put those monetary funds from like getting, I guess not having the giant panda go extinct and saving those monetary funds to go elsewhere, or would you rather save the giant panda and lose those monetary?
So I get to play God.
Yeah, basically.
That's a tough question about, the question was, if it costs so much to keep the giant panda alive, would it be better to let the panda go extinct and use the money for the benefit of many other species? Is that a fair statement of the question? There's a book called Noah's Choice that you may want to read someday, which proposes that very solution to the problem of extinction. And what these authors propose is that we create a triage, just the way you do at a military hospital. And you evaluate the condition of each of these species, and the ones that are too far gone to really warrant attention, you let them go. And you spend your efforts on the ones that still have a reasonable chance. That's a pretty cold-blooded way to go about it. It's intellectualizing a problem that is difficult to intellectualize. But it has been seriously suggested. And the reason that the people that suggest it defend it, the way they defend it is, we're doing it anyway. By dint of the fact that we can't save everything, because we're not. We're sort of inadvertently making those choices without thinking about it. We're letting species go that we perhaps could have saved if we had thought about it and devoted some efforts to it. So, in my mind, you see, as an intellectual thought exercise, I can say, yeah, that makes some sense. But in my heart, to say, let's let the giant panda go, that's an awfully hard choice to. I wouldn't want to be on that panel that made that decision.